I would say we've been in a depression since 2007, that the entire so-called recovery from 2009 to 2019, it was a 10-year recovery, the longest recovery in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest recovery in 10-year history. The average annual growth for that 10-year period was 2.2%. But for all post-1980 recoveries, average growth was 3.2%. And if you go back to post-World War II recoveries, it's closer to 4%. So if you have an economy that can grow 3-4% and you're growing at about 2%, that 1% is, yeah, what 1%? What's the big deal? Sorry, 1% of 20 trillion compounded for 10 years is a big number. So I would say we've been in depression in 2007, but the new Great Depression is where we are now. It's, by the way, that book has 3 chapters on economics, the new Great Depression, but also has 3 chapters on the pandemic. So it's kind of it's a mixture of the impact of the pandemic and then the effect it had on the economy.
Fantastic book.
You can't disentangle the two. I had a debate with my editors. Jim, we love you on economics, but you're not an epidemiologist. I said, well, I know I'm not. I'll admit to that. But you can't, writing about the economy and not mentioning the pandemics, like talking about property damage in New Orleans in 2005 and not mentioning Hurricane Katrina. I mean, you have to mention the pandemic, and I did. And I included a chapter on the mental health aspects, by the way. There's a lot in that book that was way ahead of today's conventional wisdom. I said I concluded that the virus came from a laboratory in Wuhan, that today that's the consensus. I said that lockdowns don't work. Today, that's the consensus. Masks don't work. Today, that's the consensus. But all this stuff was heretical, a year ago when the book came out, but it's all in there. But as it relates to the economy, it's just one more reason. Now, having said all that, yeah, COVID has not gone away. The pandemic's still here. It's still depressing growth. In 2021, we don't have the fourth quarter numbers yet. It looks like the fourth quarter will be decent, maybe relatively strong. The third quarter was quite weak. The fourth quarter of 2020 was quite weak. We did have another strong quarter along the way in 2021. So it's kind of jumpy. We're getting some strong quarters followed by weak quarters. But now I would expect that to trend lower. I think we're going to see that very quickly. And in addition to the pandemic, which we just talked about, there's a new headwind to growth, a big one, which is the supply chain breakdown. And that's an area I'm devoting a lot of time and research to right now. So between the new Omicron variant, which fortunately appears mild, it's highly contagious and relatively mild. So it's kind of like the cold or viral flu version of COVID, but it's around and it's affecting. People can't believe how quickly it's torn through New York City. I mean, and nationally look for 1 million new cases a day. Now, fortunately, they're mild, but it's still enough to keep people home from work. It's still enough to, some people unfortunately are in the hospital. But even if you're home for 10 days, you're not working for those 10 days. So this is a new headwind on top. And then we have the supply chain crisis. Yeah, well, the $15,000 goal is actually very straightforward. It's not a number I pulled out of the air. It's not a number I made up to, attract attention. You don't really need that. But it is the number that goal would have to be, or higher. I mean, it's a base, but it's the lowest number the goal would have to be if you were going to use gold to support the value of the U.S. dollar. So we know what the money supply is. The Fed publishes that. We know how much gold we have. And so if you were going to go on a gold standard, you would basically have to say, well, what's the value of an ounce of gold? Where am I going to set it? Because that's what a gold standard is. Russia's reserves just hit a new all-time high of 600 billion. And the gold component is 20% of that. So over $120 billion in gold, about 2,300 tons. And everyone's like, well, yeah, but the U.S. has 8,000 tons. They only have, maybe a little over a quarter of that, but their economy is only 1/12 the size.